You've built a company from nothing, invested everything you have, convinced investors to give you millions. And now, in 1973, you're days away from total bankruptcy. The company has $5,000 left, not enough to fuel the planes for another week. Payroll is due. Creditors are circling. Your employees don't know the company is dying, and you're standing at a crossroads. Accept failure or do something desperate. Fred Smith, founder of Federal Express, chose desperate. He took that last $5,000, flew to Las Vegas, walked into a casino, and gambled it on blackjack. By Monday morning, he had $27,000. Enough to keep the planes flying, enough to make payroll, enough to survive one more week. That week turned into funding. That funding turned into survival. And that survival turned Federal Express into FedEx, a $65 billion company. This is the story of the most reckless decision that somehow worked. Let's go back to how it got this bad. Fred Smith wasn't some gambler. He was a Yale graduate, Marine Corps veteran, serious guy. In 1971, at age 27, he founded Federal Express with one revolutionary idea: overnight delivery. Before FedEx, if you needed to ship something fast, you had limited options. The Postal Service took days. Airlines shipped cargo, but on passenger routes, which meant delays and lost packages. Smith saw an opportunity: build a system designed specifically for packages. Hub and spoke model. All planes fly to Memphis every night. Packages sorted, redistributed, delivered next morning, anywhere in America. Guaranteed. The idea was brilliant, but executing it required something no startup had ever attempted. He needed planes. Lots of them. He needed a massive sorting facility in Memphis. He needed infrastructure across the country. He needed to convince businesses to trust a company that didn't exist yet. The capital required was staggering. Smith raised $91 million in 1971. For a startup, that's equivalent to over $600 million today. It was the largest startup funding round in history at the time. And it still wasn't enough. Federal Express launched operations in April 1973. The first night, they delivered 186 packages to 25 cities. They expected thousands. The revenue barely covered fuel costs. Businesses were skeptical. Why trust this new company when existing services, though slower, were reliable? The overnight delivery market didn't exist yet. Smith was trying to create demand for something people didn't know they needed. Classic entrepreneurial problem. You're too early, you're burning cash, and you're running out of runway. By the summer of 1973, Federal Express was in free fall. They were losing over $1 million a month. Fuel costs were skyrocketing due to the oil crisis. The company had spent almost all the investor money. Creditors were demanding payment. Planes were grounded because they couldn't afford fuel. Smith was personally $27 million in debt. He had taken out loans against his family inheritance. Everything was leveraged. Everything was at risk. And the board of directors wanted to shut it down. Cut losses, declare bankruptcy, move on. Smith refused. He believed the model would work if they could just survive long enough. But belief doesn't pay for jet fuel. The company needed cash immediately. Smith called investors. They said no. He went to banks. They laughed him out. Schneider Dynamics, which had sold them planes, was threatening to repossess them unless Federal Express paid what they owed. The company had $5,000 in the bank. That was it. Not enough to fuel the fleet, not enough to make payroll, not enough to survive the week. This is where the story gets insane. Smith was in Chicago trying to secure emergency funding. Another rejection? He was supposed to fly back to Memphis and tell his employees the company was done. Instead, he flew to Las Vegas. He later said he figured $5,000 wasn't going to save the company anyway. If he was going to fail, he might as well take a shot. He walked into a casino, sat down at a blackjack table, and played. Now, Fred Smith has never publicly detailed exactly how much he won on which hands. The number $27,000 comes from company lore and interviews with early employees. Some versions say he played blackjack. Others say it was roulette. Smith himself has been vague about the details, but the core story is confirmed. He went to Vegas with $5,000. He gambled. He won. He came back with enough money to keep the company alive for another week. That's not disputed. And that week made all the difference. With the $27,000, Federal Express fueled the planes and made payroll. Employees had no idea how close they'd come to bankruptcy. The next week, Smith used that narrow survival window to make one final desperate pitch to investors. He convinced General Dynamics to delay the repossession. He got one more investor to inject capital. Not a lot, but enough to cover another few weeks. Then another investor came in. Then a small contract with a big client. Then momentum started building. Slowly, painfully, but it built. By the end of 1973, Federal Express was still losing money, but they were operational. Revenue was growing. The concept was starting to prove itself. By 1975, they were breaking even. By 1976, they turned a profit. Smith had survived. The company had survived. And the Vegas gamble became legend. The story that defined Fred Smith's willingness to bet everything. Let's be clear about something. This was reckless. Stupidly reckless. Taking your company's last $5,000 in gambling, it is not a business strategy. It's desperation masquerading as courage. Smith got lucky. If he'd lost, Federal Express would have collapsed days earlier. Employees would have lost their jobs. Investors would have lost everything. Smith would have been personally bankrupt and probably sued. The Vegas trip wasn't genius. It was a Hail Mary that happened to work. But here's what's interesting about desperate decisions. They reveal character. Smith wasn't some wild gambler by nature. He was calculated, disciplined. A Marine who served in Vietnam. The Vegas trip was out of character, which means it was situational. He was out of options. The company was dead either way, so he took the only shot he had left. And there's something worth examining in that. When you're truly out of options, when the conventional paths are closed, sometimes the irrational move is the only move. Not because it's smart, but because doing nothing guarantees failure. There's another layer to the story. Smith's willingness to risk everything wasn't just about Vegas. He'd already risked everything multiple times. He'd invested his entire inheritance. He'd taken on massive personal debt. He'd convinced his family and friends to invest. He'd staked his reputation. The Vegas bet was just one more chip pushed to the center of the table. By the time he walked into that casino, he'd already gone all in. The $5,000 was symbolic. It represented a mindset, a refusal to accept defeat until the last possible moment. FedEx today is a completely different company. $65 billion in annual revenue, 475,000 employees, 445,000 shipments every day. They invented modern logistics. The hub-and-spoke system Smith designed is now standard across industries. Express delivery created entire business models. Amazon couldn't exist without reliable overnight shipping. The global economy depends on logistics networks. FedEx pioneered. All of it nearly died in 1973. Fred Smith retired as CEO in 2022. He's now worth $5.7 billion. The company he almost lost in Vegas is one of the most valuable logistics companies in the world. And the blackjack story is still told in business schools as a cautionary tale and inspiration, depending on who is teaching. Some professors say it proves entrepreneurship requires irrational risk-taking. Others say it proves luck matters more than skill. Both are probably right. Here's what I think the lesson actually is. Survival is not elegance. When you're building something from nothing, you will face moments where all the reasonable options are gone. The funding dries up. The customers don't come. The plan doesn't work. And you're left with a choice. Quit or do something desperate. Fred Smith chose desperate. He gambled $5,000 he didn't have on a game of chance, and it worked. Not because it was smart, but because sometimes desperation plus luck equals survival. And survival is all you need to get to the next day. And the next day might bring the opportunity that changes everything. Would I recommend gambling your company's last money in Vegas? Absolutely not. Should this story be taught as a viable business strategy? No. But should it be told as a reminder that entrepreneurship is brutal, irrational, and sometimes saved by pure chance? Yes. Because that's the truth. The clean success stories you read about in business magazines do show you the moments where everything almost collapsed, where the founder made an insane decision that happened to work. Fred Smith's blackjack win isn't a strategy. It is a reminder that the distance between massive success and total failure is sometimes $27,000 and a lucky hand. FedEx exists today not because of that Vegas trip. It exists because Smith built a revolutionary business model that worked. But it almost didn't get the chance to prove itself, and that's the real story. Great ideas die every day because they run out of time. Federal Express survives because Fred Smith bought one more week. With money he won at a blackjack table. When you're out of options, sometimes the craziest decision is the only one left. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it works.